Maria had always felt the weight of the subtle, and sometimes not so subtle, racism around her. Growing up in a mostly black neighborhood on the outskirts of the city, it was something she learned to live with. There were the stares when she walked into certain stores, the way people clutched their bags a little tighter when she passed by. Even in school, teachers always seemed to treat her and her classmates differently, as if they expected less from them. And then there were the police, cruising through her neighborhood like they were patrolling enemy territory, ready to pounce at the first sign of trouble. Still, it was something she had pushed to the back of her mind, just part of life. But as Maria got older and pursued her dream of being a journalist, those small moments started to feel bigger. Reporting on local stories, she couldn't ignore the patterns anymore. The systemic inequality, the injustice. It wasn't just in the air, it was baked into every institution around her. Things really shifted for Maria when she was assigned to cover a protest against police brutality. It was supposed to be a routine job, but what she saw that day changed everything. The protesters were mostly young black men and women, marching peacefully, demanding justice. Yet they were met with a line of police officers in riot gear, shields up, as if they were preparing for war. The tension was thick, like a storm about to break. Maria stood on the sidelines, scribbling in her notebook, trying to stay professional. But her chest felt tight with anger, her hands shaking as she wrote. The way the police looked at the crowd, with suspicion, with disdain, was the same way they had looked at her and everyone she knew for as long as she could remember. She felt the protesters' frustration like it was her own, because in a way, it was. That night, sitting in her small, dimly lit apartment, Maria couldn't shake the feeling that her work wasn't making a real difference. Reporting on these events felt like scratching the surface. The stories she was telling barely reached the people who needed to hear them. It wasn't enough. That's when the idea came to her. Invisible voices. What if there was a space dedicated to the people whose stories never made it to the front page? What if there was a platform for people like her, from communities like hers, who were tired of being invisible? The more she thought about it, the more it made sense. Maria didn't want to just report the news. She wanted to amplify the voices that were always silenced. With the help of a few friends who believed in her vision, Maria got to work. They designed a simple website and called it Invisible Voices. It wasn't flashy, but it had a purpose: to give power to the stories no one else was telling. This was the beginning of something bigger than Maria could have ever imagined. The launch of Invisible Voices was quiet at first. Maria shared the link with a few people in her circle, and they passed it on to others. It wasn't long before the first story came in, one that hit close to home. A young man from Maria's own neighborhood had been brutally beaten by police just a few months ago. He hadn't been doing anything wrong. He was just walking home after visiting his cousin when the cops stopped him for looking suspicious. That story was all too familiar to Maria. She had walked those same streets, and she knew how easily suspicion could turn into violence when you were black. But this wasn't just any story. It was personal. She reached out to the young man's family to get their side of things. His mother, an older woman with tired eyes, had been hesitant at first, worried about what more attention might bring. But she agreed to talk, her voice shaky as she recounted the night her son came home bruised and bloodied. "I didn't even recognize him at first," she whispered, wiping away a tear. "They treated him like he was an animal, and for what? Walking home?" Maria felt her chest tighten as she listened. She knew she had to tell this story right, to give it the weight it deserved. She spent hours writing and rewriting, making sure every word hit hard. She didn't want to sugarcoat anything. The pain, the fear, the injustice, it all needed to be laid bare. When she finally published the piece, she wasn't sure what to expect. She clicked the post button and sat back, staring at the screen. The first few hours were slow, but then it picked up. Comments started pouring in. Some people were outraged, sharing their own stories of police harassment and brutality. Others offered support to the family, promising to fight for justice. But then came the hate. Anonymous messages flooded her inbox, telling her to back off, calling her a liar, accusing her of stirring up trouble where there was none. The words stung, but Maria knew this was part of the territory. Telling the truth wasn't always safe, especially when it challenged the status quo. Still, the threats weighed on her. She lay awake at night, thinking about the angry messages, the possibility of someone showing up at her door. Fear crept in, threatening to drown out the fire that had pushed her to start this whole thing. But every time she thought about quitting, she remembered the young man's mother, her voice shaking as she told her story. Maria knew she couldn't back down. Not now, not ever. The response to the first story was overwhelming. Maria hadn't expected Invisible Voices to take off so quickly, but the community was hungry for it. People began reaching out to her, wanting to share their own stories, experiences of racial profiling, harassment, and injustice that had been buried for too long. The platform had tapped into something raw, something real. But with that came more pressure. The threats Maria had received after the first story didn't stop. In fact, they grew louder. The anonymous messages kept coming, warning her to stay quiet, calling her a troublemaker. It seemed like every time she posted a new story, the hate would escalate. There were nights when Maria sat alone in her apartment, staring at her phone, wondering if she'd gone too far. She felt torn. On one hand, she knew the power of the stories she was sharing. On the other hand, the fear was starting to get to her. What if someone actually followed through on one of those threats? What if she was putting her life, or the lives of others, at risk? Despite everything, Maria decided she had to do something bigger. It wasn't enough to just write these stories. People needed to come together, to talk about what was happening face to face. That's when she got the idea for a community meeting. Somewhere people could feel safe enough to share their experiences and talk about solutions. She reached out to a few friends, activists she'd met through her work, and they helped her organize it. The night of the event, Maria stood in front of a small crowd, her heart racing. She wasn't used to public speaking, and the weight of what they were discussing made the air feel heavy. But as people began sharing their stories, one after the other, she realized this was exactly what was needed. A woman stood up and talked about her teenage son, who'd been stopped by police 3 times in 1 week just for walking to school. An older man shared how he had been denied a job for years, never told why, but always suspecting the color of his skin had something to do with it. The stories flowed, and with each one, Maria saw the pain that had been bottled up for so long. By the end of the night, the room felt lighter. There was still anger, still frustration, but something else had taken root too: hope. For the first time in a long time, people felt like they weren't alone in this fight. They had a space where their voices mattered, where their stories weren't ignored. As Maria helped clean up the chairs after the meeting, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about telling stories anymore. It was about building a movement, something bigger than herself. The road ahead would be tough, but she wasn't alone, and that made all the difference. As the days passed after the community meeting, Maria began to see just how powerful Invisible Voices had become. More and more people were reaching out with their stories, and the platform was starting to gain traction beyond her neighborhood. Other communities were beginning to take notice, and with that attention came both praise and, unfortunately, more backlash. The threats grew worse. What started as hateful messages online had escalated into something much more personal. One morning, Maria found a note taped to her front door. It wasn't long, just a few scribbled words: "Stop, or you'll regret it." Her stomach dropped when she read it. This wasn't just online trolling anymore. Someone knew where she lived. For a moment, fear washed over her. She sat in her apartment, her mind racing. What if they were serious? What if something happened to her? The fear was real, But so was the reason she'd started all of this in the first place. Invisible voices had already made a difference. She could see it in the way people were speaking out, coming together. Giving up now would mean silencing those voices again. She couldn't do that. Still, Maria wasn't naive. She knew that continuing this fight would require more than just determination. She needed protection, not just for herself, but for the people who were part of the movement. So, she reached out to Tasha, a civil rights lawyer she had met at the community meeting. Tasha had been working in social justice for years and had seen these kinds of threats before. When Maria told her about the note, Tasha didn't seem surprised. Instead, she calmly suggested they form a community safety group. They needed to make sure that everyone involved in Invisible Voices was protected, not just physically, but legally too. They'd need to be smart, organized, and prepared for whatever might come next. The first meeting of the safety group was small but serious. They discussed ways to stay safe, like organizing volunteers to walk people home after events, ensuring that no one was left alone in vulnerable situations, and keeping records of any threats or harassment. It was a sobering reminder of the dangers they were facing, but it also brought a sense of solidarity. They weren't just individuals fighting their own battles anymore. They were a community, standing together. As the meeting wrapped up, Maria felt a mix of exhaustion and relief. She was tired of the fear, tired of the constant pressure, but she also felt more grounded than she had in weeks. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but knowing she had a team of people who had her back made it a little less daunting. That night, as she lay in bed, Maria thought about everything they had discussed. The threats were real, but so was the power of their movement. And now, more than ever, she knew that Invisible Voices wasn't just about telling stories. It was about building something that couldn't be easily torn down. It was about resilience. Word spread quickly about the growing movement around Invisible Voices. More people began to get involved, and before long, Maria found herself organizing something much bigger than a community meeting. This time, it was a protest. The stories shared on her platform had started a fire, and people were ready to take to the streets, demanding justice for the victims of police brutality and racial profiling. The protest was set for a Saturday afternoon. Maria worked day and night with her team, making sure everything was in place. They secured permits, coordinated with local activists, and set up safety measures. It was going to be a peaceful protest, but Maria knew from experience how quickly things could escalate. The tension between the police and the community had been simmering for years, and all it took was one wrong move for things to spiral out of control. The day of the protest, the streets were buzzing with energy. Hundreds of people showed up, holding signs, chanting, and demanding change. Maria stood at the front, her heart pounding, not just from the excitement, but from the weight of what this meant. This wasn't just about the stories anymore. It was about showing that their voices couldn't be ignored. But the police were there too, lined up along the streets in full riot gear. Their presence was intimidating, their faces hard and unyielding. Maria could feel the tension in the air, thick like humidity before a storm. She took a deep breath and stepped forward, gripping the microphone in her hand. "We're here today because our voices matter," she began, her voice steady despite the nerves. "We're here because we will no longer be silent about the injustices we face every day. We're here for those who can't speak for themselves, and we will not back down." The crowd erupted in cheers, their energy fueling Maria's courage. But as she continued to speak, she noticed the police moving closer. They were inching forward, shields up, ready for something, anything, to justify force. Her heart raced as she realized the situation was becoming more dangerous by the second. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the streets. Panic rippled through the crowd, and in an instant, everything changed. People started running in all directions, chaos unfolding as the peaceful protest turned into a frenzy. Maria's instincts kicked in. She ducked behind a car as tear gas filled the air. Her eyes burned, and she coughed uncontrollably, struggling to see through the smoke. It was exactly what she had feared. The protest had been peaceful, but the police had escalated the situation. Maria's phone buzzed in her pocket, messages flooding in from people trying to figure out what had happened, where to go, and how to stay safe. As the chaos unfolded, Maria knew this moment would only fuel the movement further. But in that terrifying instant, all she could think about was getting out alive and making sure the people around her were safe. The aftermath of the protest was nothing like what Maria had hoped for. What should have been a powerful statement of unity and resistance had turned into a scene of chaos, with images of tear gas, frightened protesters, and police in riot gear flooding the news. The media spun it as a violent outburst, conveniently ignoring how the tension had been sparked by the heavy-handed response from law enforcement. Maria watched the coverage with a sick feeling in her stomach. But even as she sat there, exhausted and overwhelmed, messages of support came pouring in. People who had been at the protest, people who had watched from home, and even those from other cities reached out to her, offering words of solidarity. They knew what had really happened, and they weren't about to let the official narrative erase their voices. Maria spent the next few days in recovery mode, trying to process what had happened. The protest had been disrupted, but it wasn't a total loss. It had brought more attention to their cause, and more people were now invested in invisible voices than ever before. But the cost had been high. Several people had been arrested, and some were facing serious charges. One of those people was Jamal, a young man who had been on the front lines of the protest. Maria had met him just a few weeks earlier, when he'd shared his story on her platform. He had been a quiet but determined presence in the movement, always there to help, always pushing others to stay peaceful, but now he was sitting in jail, accused of inciting violence. Maria couldn't let that stand. She reached out to Tasha, the civil rights lawyer who had helped with the safety group. Together, they began to organize a legal defense for Jamal and the others who had been arrested. It wasn't easy. Resources were tight, and the police were pushing hard to make an example out of the protesters. But Maria and Tasha refused to back down. The next few weeks were a blur of legal meetings, phone calls, and fundraising efforts. Maria was exhausted, but she knew she couldn't stop. Not now. The stakes were higher than ever, and she owed it to Jamal and the others to keep fighting. Finally, after weeks of hard work, they managed to secure Jamal's release on bail. The charges were still hanging over him, but for the moment, he was free. When Maria saw him walk out of the courthouse, his face tired but determined, she felt a surge of relief. This was just one small victory, but it meant everything. That night, as they sat in a diner, talking about the next steps, Maria realized something important. The protest might not have gone as planned, but the movement was still alive. In fact, it was stronger than ever. The community was more united, more determined, and more willing to stand up for what was right. They had faced setbacks, but they were still standing. And as long as they kept going, kept telling their stories, and kept fighting for justice, nothing could truly stop them. In the months following Jamal's release, invisible voices grew in ways Maria never could have imagined. The platform had become a lifeline for people across the country, especially in communities that had been silenced for too long. Stories poured in, each one more heartbreaking and enraging than the last. But with each story, Maria felt the movement gaining strength. Maria and her team were busier than ever, not just with the website, but also with organizing events, supporting those still fighting legal battles and expanding their reach. It felt like a never-ending cycle of work, but Maria didn't mind. She had never felt more fulfilled, more purposeful. This was exactly why she had started Invisible Voices, to give people a platform, to push for justice, to make real, tangible change. But with the growth came new challenges. Keeping the momentum going wasn't easy. The larger the movement became, the more attention it drew from those in power, and not in a good way. Maria was constantly fielding threats, both legal and physical. It seemed like every day there was a new hurdle, a new reason to question whether it was all worth it. One afternoon, Maria received a letter from a law firm representing the city. The language was stiff and formal, but the message was clear. They were threatening to sue Invisible Voices for defamation. The letter accused her of spreading lies and damaging the reputation of the police department and the city officials. Maria felt a chill run down her spine as she read it. This was serious. She immediately called Tasha, who had been by her side through everything. Together, they reviewed the letter and discussed their options. Tasha was calm, as always, but Maria could sense the tension in her voice. This wasn't just an empty threat. It was an attempt to shut them down. For a brief moment, Maria felt the weight of it all crushing her. She had fought so hard, and now they were coming after her in a way she hadn't expected. Could she really go up against the city? Did she have the resources, the energy to keep this fight going? But then she thought about Jamal, about the young man from her neighborhood who had been beaten by the police, about the countless people whose stories had been shared on her platform. She couldn't stop now. She wouldn't stop now. Instead of backing down, Maria decided to push forward. She and Tasha rallied their supporters, reaching out to other activists, journalists, and lawyers. They organized a campaign to raise awareness about the city's attempts to silence them. It wasn't long before national media picked up the story. Suddenly, Invisible Voices was in the spotlight again, but this time on a much bigger stage. Major news outlets were talking about the lawsuit, framing it as a battle between free speech and systemic oppression. Maria found herself giving interviews, speaking at rallies, and fighting harder than ever before. The city had thought they could intimidate her into silence, but all they had done was ignite a fire she couldn't put out. And just like that, Maria realized something important. This fight, as exhausting and overwhelming as it wasn't just about her or Invisible Voices anymore. It was about everyone who had ever been silenced, everyone who had ever been told their voice didn't matter. They were all rising together, refusing to be pushed back into the shadows. Months had passed since the lawsuit, and despite all the pressure, Maria and Invisible Voices had only grown stronger. The city eventually backed down, realizing that they were fighting a losing battle. The lawsuit had been dropped, and with it came a wave of relief. But more importantly, it became a turning point for the movement. The stories that continued to pour into Invisible Voices were no longer just about pain and injustice. They were stories of resilience, of communities coming together, of change happening in small but powerful ways. In Maria's city, police reform talks had begun, spurred by the pressure her platform had applied. The stories that once felt buried were now part of a larger narrative, one that was impossible to ignore. But the greatest change came when Maria least expected it. One evening, she received a message from Jamal, the young man who had been at the center of so much of their struggle. He had been quiet for some time, focusing on rebuilding his life after the protest and his legal battles. When Maria opened the message, she smiled. It was an invitation to speak at a local high school about his experiences, to share how Invisible Voices had impacted his life. The thought of Jamal standing in front of a group of students, talking about his story and the movement, filled Maria with a sense of pride she hadn't anticipated. It was proof that the work they were doing was making a difference, that the voices they had amplified were inspiring others. On the day of the talk, Maria sat in the back of the school auditorium, watching as Jamal stood at the podium. He was nervous at first, but as he spoke, his confidence grew. He talked about how the platform had given him the courage to stand up for himself, how it had connected him with people who shared his experiences, and how it had opened his eyes to the power of storytelling. He ended his talk with a message to the students. Your voice matters. Don't let anyone tell you it doesn't. Speak up, stand tall, and fight for what's right. Because when we all raise our voices, we can change the world. Maria felt tears well up in her eyes as the students gave Jamal a standing ovation. This was the legacy of invisible voices, not just the stories themselves, but the ripple effect they created, the courage they inspired, the change they sparked. As Maria left the auditorium that day, she felt a quiet peace settle over her. There was still so much work to be done, but she knew they were on the right path. Invisible Voices had started as a small idea, a way for Maria to channel her own frustration and grief, but it had grown into something much bigger, something that would live on, long after the last story was told. And as long as there were people willing to speak out, willing to fight for justice, the legacy of Invisible Voices would never fade.